Thank you very much for coming to my presentation today. This is a topic I've been very excited to share with the community for a long time. I have a lot of information to go over, probably more than I actually have time to talk about, so I might be skipping over a bunch of stuff. My apologies, but I really want to leave some time at the end for you all to ask questions as well. So with that being said, my talk today, I call it Census Data, Confusion, Manipulation, and Latinos of Mixed Ancestry, or should Latino be a race? Why are we talking about this today? I hope to demonstrate for you that the way the census is currently designed, we encounter the following problems. Missed opportunity to capture the diversity of the Latino population. This may not sound all that important, but hey, there are psychological benefits of knowing who you are. And this is foundational to determining future trends in the community as well. I've also found that there's offset data due to the methodology that the census is currently using and other people are adopting. There's a potential undercount of Latinos because of the way that the census is currently collecting data, and numbers translate into political clout as well. And then there's potential for biased reporting. Again, we need to trust the data and the policy decisions that people are making based on that data. So we need to consider making some changes. I will be starting off by talking about the history of the Hispanic question on the census, followed by the examples of the problems arising from the current methodology, like I mentioned, offset data, biased data, and even the manipulated data. And then I'll conclude by a proposal that is out there for a new methodology in counting Latinos. So with that being said, let's talk about the history. This is an image, I hope you can see it, of the way the 2010 census ethnicity and race questions appeared. Note that the first question here, question 5, asks for Hispanic origin, and the second question asks for race. Hispanic is often referred to as an ethnicity by the census to distinguish it from race. Several Hispanic ethnic options are given, including a blank to write in a Hispanic ethnicity. But oftentimes, these get collapsed to report a single Hispanic population. And this is what I will be referring to in general as Hispanic or Latino. And I should just put a little disclaimer. I will be using Hispanic and Latino interchangeably. I consider them mostly synonymous. My preferred term is Latino, but the census uses Hispanic, so oftentimes I'll be referring to the term Hispanic just to be consistent with the census language. The second question also offers many opportunities to list a variety of races. However, like the Hispanic question, these options get collapsed down into 6 groups: white, black, American Indian or Alaskan Native, Asian, Pacific Islander, or some other race. Now, oftentimes you will hear the phrase, Hispanics can be of any race. Well, that stems from the ability to select Hispanic on the first question, and then any racial category on the second. The Hispanic question was introduced in the 1970 census by the Nixon administration. It has been suggested that this was done by the Republican Party to gain favor with the burgeoning Latino voter population. Kim Williams, in her book, Mark One or More, relates a story told by former Census Bureau official Conrad Teuber of how the question was rushed onto the forms. The forms were actually out to print and had to be pulled back to include this new question, and has been problematic ever since. So at any rate, trying to keep a mental picture of how these questions are presented, because I'll be referring back to it as I go along. This is a chart of several organizations that developed starting in the late 70s and early 80s. Multiracial organizations started forming all across the country. This is from the book Mark One or More. That shows most of them of various membership sizes. Most notably, we see iPride here in Berkeley, San Francisco, Biracial Family Network in Chicago, Interracial Family Circle in DC, Project Race down here in Georgia, and then of course Mask here in Los Angeles. One group that's not shown on this chart is the HAPA Issues Forum, which began as a student group on the UC Berkeley campus, but then became a nonprofit organization, but is now defunct. Now, several of these organizations, including Mask, joined together to form a coalition called the Association of Multi-Ethnic Americans, or AMIA for short. Together, they lobbied the federal government to change the census to recognize multiracial people. Now, how that actually happened is a long and storied history that I don't have time to go into, but the short version is that in 1997, American history changed. The modern multiracial movement was successful in convincing the Office of Management and Budget, known as the OMB, the department that oversees the census, to revise their standards for collecting race and ethnicity, known as Directive 15. And they changed it to allow people to mark off one or more race on the federal forms, including the census. Now, this is the first time in U.S. history that such an option existed. Of course, there were categories such as quadroon and octoroon in the past, but they were individual categories. This is unique, and that respondents were still able to claim full identity in multiple groups instead of having to pick just one. But you might be asking yourself, what about the Hispanic ethnicity question? Race question changed. What happened to the Hispanic ethnicity? Well, some consideration for changing the ethnicity question to allow multiple or mixed Hispanic identity was made, and you can read that in the OMB's thinking in this regard on the October 30th, 1997 Federal Register, which I've copied here. In fact, a lot of ink was spent explaining their rationale, but essentially it boils down to 2 points that I have highlighted here. I'm just going to read part of it. While a considerable amount of research was focused on how to improve the response rate to the Hispanic origin question, it is unclear if this would affect non-responses to the race question or hamper obtaining more detailed data. Whew, mouthful. In other words, they never studied what would happen if they allowed multiple responses and how that would affect the data. And the census is rather conservative. They usually don't do anything without testing their proposals first. Usually. When the Hispanic question was first introduced in 1970, it was untested when they put it in. The second point that they made, while there has been considerable public concern about classifying people of mixed racial heritage, there has been little comment on reporting both an Hispanic and non-Hispanic origin. In other words, during their open comment period on these issues, they didn't receive enough comments to warrant seriously considering changing the question. Or to put it simply, they didn't think people cared enough about this issue to do anything about it. Of course, one may ask, how do people know that a comment period exists and that they should be submitting their comments? Well, the answer to that is it's the job of community organizations such as Mask and others to take this message to the people and motivate them to respond. So when I think back on this part of history, I like to describe it as the great unfinished work of a previous generation of activists. Now, a caution about judging them too harshly. After all, I was there amongst them as well. Plus, you have to realize what a monumental task it was just to change the race question in the first place, let alone taking on the Hispanic question. Still, that was then. This is now, so maybe it's time to take a look at it again. So let's take a closer look at the Hispanic question. Now I've blown it up so you can all see it. Let's just read through it. It begins, is this person of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? Now right off the bat, you can see there is no instruction to mark one or more. In fact, there's no instruction to mark only one either. So right away, a person that identifies with both Latino and non-Latino backgrounds, persons such as myself, will be confused and frustrated with the question. Then let's see what we encounter next. Quote, no, not of Hispanic or Spanish origin. Yes, Mexican American. Yes, Puerto Rican. Yes, Cuban. And then yes, etc. You can kind of write in your own blank if you want. So how should a person of mixed ancestry answer this? Should you check both no and yes at the same time? That makes no sense. And also note how the first category has no in boldface type, almost encouraging you to mark no. And then imagine, what if they had the same no and yes on the race question? What if the category started yes, white, and no, not white? There would be an uproar over that. So obviously the way this question is worded is very problematic. And you might be wondering, what would the census do if someone marked multiple boxes on that form? This text was taken from a report put out by the census based on the American Community Survey, also known as the ACS, which is an annual survey conducted by the Census Bureau. So while it is not the actual census, it adopts the same methodology. So we can read it right here. Quote, a single origin will be randomly selected from the original reported origins for multiple Hispanic or multiple non-Hispanic responses. On the other hand, part Hispanic responses will be edited differently. All part Hispanic responses will be coded as Hispanic. So a person of mixed Hispanic background, such as Cuban and Mexican, will be randomly assigned to only one category. And a person of mixed Hispanic and non-Hispanic background will be counted simply as Hispanic. So according to the Census Bureau, there is no mixing of Hispanics with non-Hispanics. I like to refer to this as the one-drop rule for Hispanics, for those that are familiar with that concept. That, of course, cannot be further from the truth as far as how Latinos actually mix with people. So now that we know how we got to where we are today, what the forms look like today, what are some of the consequences of this methodology? We can start by looking at offset data.